back, and now we want to talk about trigonometry. So we've already talked about what geometry is, which is the study of shapes of objects. And then we talked about what algebra is, which is the representation of properties of something using letters and then manipulating those letters in terms of formulas. And now trigonometry is kind of a combination of geometry and algebra because it deals with a triangle. And in particular, the triangle that's going to be used is going to be called a right triangle because this angle over here is 90 degrees. So that's the definition of a right triangle. And so this right triangle is going to have a hypotenuse from here to here, and then it's going to have an opposite side, and then it's going to have an adjacent side with respect to this angle right here. So that angle is what we're going to be using to define the trigonometry functions. And notice that the opposite side is opposite to the angle, and the adjacent is right next to the angle, and then of course this is the hypotenuse here. So there are four main functions that are used in trigonometry. The first one I think should be familiar to you, which is the Pythagorean theorem. So you should be familiar with something like h squared is equal to a squared plus b squared, where a squared is going to be the opposite side squared, and then b is this distance here squared, and then h is going to be this distance, and then you have to square it. So that's called the Pythagorean theorem. But the ones that you may not be familiar with are these other three. So you have the cosine of this angle is going to be defined to be the adjacent side, so this length right here, divided by this length right here. Then the sine of the angle is defined to be the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. And then notice that the tangent is kind of a combination of the cosine and the sine because it's the opposite divided by the adjacent. Now, at this point, you don't know yet how to use your calculator in order to compute the cosine, the sine, and the tangent. Maybe you do, but I'm assuming that you don't know how to do that yet. And so in a future lesson, I will show you how to take this angle and then put it on your calculator and then calculate the cosine, the sine, and the tangent. So I'm just going to basically tell you what the results are, and then later we'll practice with our calculators on this. Now notice this is in blue, so that means that if you're one of my students, you really don't need to worry about trigonometry. In my astronomy course, we do one lab that uses the tangent. That's it. So in my trigonometry, or in my physics classes, we don't really use trigonometry. And then in geology, we don't use trigonometry. And in astronomy, we use it once. Okay, so this is just mainly for your entertainment value. Are you entertained? I hope that you are. So you're learning hopefully a little bit about trigonometry here. But don't worry about this as being part of the classes that you're going to have to take if you take me. All right, so let's go to some examples of how to use this. Okay, so our first example here is going to be, we know what the hypotenuse is. We know what the opposite side is, but we don't know what the adjacent side is. So how are we going to figure out this length over here? Now remember, you can always get a ruler and a protractor, and you could make this triangle with a ruler, and then you could actually measure this adjacent side, and then you could figure out what the answer is geometrically. But this is going to be more accurate using trigonometry in order to figure out what the missing side is. So if we go back to our 4 formulas here, the question is, which of these 4 formulas do we want to use to solve the problem? Well, you should notice that the angle is not given. So that means that the only formula that we can use is the Pythagorean theorem. So the Pythagorean theorem does not use the angle. So that what we're going to do is plug in the hypotenuse, plug in the opposite side, and then solve it for the letter x. And notice you do need to take a square root on that. And so you end up with 11.5 for this side over here. All right, so let's go to another example of how to use this. And this time we want to find, okay, so this is the one that we want to do. Notice that this time we're given this angle. It's a 50-degree angle. We're given this side here, and the goal is to figure out the hypotenuse. Okay, we can't use the Pythagorean theorem because we don't know what this side over here is. So in order to use the Pythagorean theorem, you've got to have 2 of the sides, and then you can figure out what the hypotenuse had to be. Okay, but we don't know that. But we are given the angle. So that means, so if we go back to our 3 equations, we've got the cosine of the angle, the sine of the angle, and the tangent of the angle. So which one do we want to use? Well, notice that we are trying to find the hypotenuse, so that means we can't use the tangent because the tangent only involves the opposite side and the adjacent side. It doesn't involve the hypotenuse. So now we're down to these 2, and we're given in the problem the adjacent, so that means we've got to use the cosine. We're going to have to use the cosine in order to solve this problem. Okay, and so we're going to say the cosine of the angle is the adjacent divided by the hypotenuse. We're going to plug in the angle, plug in the adjacent side, and now it's on our calculator. We are going to put 50 and then press the cosine button on your calculator. I will show you how to do that later. And that turns out to be 0.642. Now it's algebra, because all we've got to do now is rearrange the formula so it says hypotenuse equals something, and then that turns out to be 8.6. All right, for our final example, let's go to this one. And now we don't know the angle, but we do know these 2 sides. And the goal is to figure out the missing angle. Again, the Pythagorean theorem is not going to help us because we're looking for the angle, and the angle is not part of the Pythagorean theorem. So that means, once again, we're going to have to use one of the 3 trig functions. Okay, which one are we going to use? So we know the adjacent and we know the opposite. So what's the only one that has the adjacent and the opposite? It's the tangent. So we're going to be using the tangent one. So if we go back to here, okay, we're going to say that the tangent of the angle is equal to opposite over adjacent. We're going to plug in the opposite and the adjacent. And so now we've got the tangent of the angle is equal to 0.19. Now the question is, how do we get the angle by itself? So we need to do the opposite of a tangent. And if you recall, that was called the arc tangent. So the inverse tangent. So if we do the inverse tangent, so that's what the tan to the -1 means, of the tangent, it pops the angle out of it. So now what we got to do is the arc tangent of 0.190, and I will show you how to do that on your calculator, and the answer turns out to be 11 degrees. And so I encourage you to get out a piece of paper and a ruler and a protractor and actually make these triangles and verify that these answers are correct. So you can do all of this geometrically, but it's more accurate when you do it using trigonometry and then your calculator. All right, so that is it for trigonometry. And now we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about calculus. Ooh, doesn't that sound scary? Well, it's not too scary, but we want to talk a little bit about it. Okay, so I'll see you, hopefully, in our next segment.